Hello and welcome to the April 2021 virtual roundtable session of ICAF's virtual conference programming. My name is Biz Neidham and I'm incoming academic director for the International Comic Arts Forum. It is my pleasure to host this evening's event. Originally, ICAF 2020 conference was to be held concurrently with the Small Press Expo in September 2020. Because of COVID-19, our conference was canceled, so we have reimagined a way for accepted ICAF panelists to make their contribution to ICAF and have organized a series of online events to achieve ICAF's mission of celebrating comics through scholarship. This, however, is our last event of that series, but over the past 6 months, ICAF has been hosting monthly virtual panels and roundtables alongside a series of weekly blog posts featuring accepted ICAF presentations. All panelists who are accepted to ICAF 2020 were welcome to participate in our online programming with the intention of curating monthly events around specific themes. Please see ICAF's website for more information on our past events, as well as for the pre-recorded talks for our panel of roundtable participants and links to their presentation transcripts. Today's virtual session is entitled Critical Interventions in Comic Studies. It's been my pleasure to co-organize this roundtable event series with ICAF Program Director Frank Bramlett, and we would like to express our gratitude to the other members of the ICAF Executive Committee for their support. More importantly, however, we'd like to thank the panelists for the virtual panel associated with tonight's roundtable: Jeremy Stoll, Jonathan Flowers, Kenneth Orovitz, and Claireosinervo, for giving us the opportunity to have this rich conversation about their work. For tonight's event, ICAF member at large Andy Kunka has agreed to moderate the roundtable discussion. Andy Kunka is a professor of English and division chair at the University of South Carolina, Sumter. He is the author of autobiographical comics from Bloomsbury and the forthcoming The Life and Comics of Howard Cruse, Taking Risks in the Service of Truth from Rutgers University Press. But before we begin our roundtable session, a note on the technical side of this Zoom webinar event. First of all, this event is being recorded and will be posted online on the ICAF website after its conclusion. We're also leaving the chat function on so that members of the webinar are able to discuss the presentations or communicate with me regarding issues. However, I will be moderating the chat, and I ask that all conversation be thoughtful and respectful, as well as mindful of how excessive chatting can be distracting for all participants in today's webinar. Soon after the panelists have given a short summary of their research, we will open the floor for questions. Please submit all questions via the Q&A function, which you will find at the top or the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will endeavor to get to as many questions as possible within the time available to us, though we apologize in advance if we are not able to address all inquiries. We are grateful that we can provide free access to our conference events this year, but if you are able, we would welcome your donations through our PayPal account to help support the cost of hosting our online programming. You can find the button to donate at the bottom of the ICAF homepage, which is located at www.internationalcomicartsforum.org. Thank you again to everyone for helping to make tonight's event happen. So without further ado, I'll ask our moderator to take the lead in introducing our roundtable participants.
Thanks, Biz. And thanks also to Biz and Frank and the rest of the ICAF board for their hard work in putting together the virtual conference that we're concluding tonight. And thanks everybody too for joining us for this final roundtable. So I'm going to get started in introducing all four of our presenters, and then we'll get to each one of them in their turn. So first up, Jeremy Stoll is a comics creator, scholar, and assistant professor of science and social science at Columbus College of Art and Design. Stoll's scholarship on comics in India has appeared in the International Journal of Comic Art, Marg, a magazine of the arts, Cultures of Comic Work, and the Routledge Companion to Comics. With Dr. Benjamin Wu, he co-edited The Comics World, Comic Books, Graphic Novels, and Their Publics, coming this year from the University Press of Mississippi. As a comics creator, he is committed to visual storytelling on the ineffable in life, with recent work in Rainbow Reflections, Body Image Comics for Queer Men. Next is Jonathan Flowers. Jonathan is a visiting assistant professor at Worcester State University, where his research focuses on effective theories of experience, pragmatist approaches to artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the intersections of phenomenology and popular culture. Flowers has also presented regularly at academic conferences across the country on critical approaches to popular culture and comics, East Asian philosophy, philosophy of race, and feminism. And a cat is just walked in front of the camera. Kenneth Orovitz is a PhD candidate in Northeastern University. His research focuses on developing methods of integrating the formatted and material specificities of comic objects into comics analysis in the digital age. His research interests also include positioning analog media in a digital world, interdisciplinary applications of comic studies theory, the developing academic and artistic communities. He is also he is the founder of the Northeastern Comic Studies Group and the assistant director of the Letterpress Go's 3D digital modeling project. His article, "The Comics Shift: Modifying Material Rhetorics of Bookstores for Collaborative Category and Community Change in Image Text," is forthcoming. And finally, we have Claireosinervo, is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Calgary, where his research focuses on the transmedia world building and the values that shape fan festivals. His further interests include issues of intellectual property and authorship in media franchises, as well as games, comics, and general pop culture detritus. Clairvo recently produced a chapter on the history of digital comics for Comic Studies, a guidebook from Rutgers, and forthcoming publications include a chapter on piracy in the comics world, which I just mentioned in Jeremy's introduction. Get in touch with Clairvo at badpanels.com. Okay, so we'll let Jeremy get started, and then after all four presenters have gone, we will have questions.
Howdy, I'm Dr. Jeremy Stoll. I ended up kind of doing a remix of my original presentation intention. So I actually had a blog post combined with my presentation. As a comics creator, researcher, teacher, and professor, I am very anxious. I often experience imposter syndrome, kind of the sense that I don't know where quite I fit in. And so the question behind my presentation, who are we to lay claims to comics worlds, is something I've been asking myself since I started making comics back in 2000. And especially since I started doing comic scholarship and then also teaching comics and comic studies. All right, so I'm going to share my screen just for a couple of reference things. All right. So this was kind of the initial part of my presentation, this blog post where I went through kind of a literature review. I thought that this fit better into a blog post format to kind of be the starting point for my presentation, which hopefully you all had a chance to watch in full. But the blog post kind of tracks the need for reflexivity in comics scholarship, looking at this historical investment in appeals to high culture from scholars, and concepts like the graphic novel, how they continue to be problematic, as well as then taking into consideration the need for more of an emphasis on labor and how we often take it for granted, especially in kind of romantic notions of creativity in scholarship, focusing more on how we're part of a larger industry and communities, but specifically on how our position shapes our aesthetics. And here I kind of led into what I ended up talking about in my presentation, which is an emphasis on reflexivity and the autoethnographic kinds of methods and arguments of a lot of feminist and Black criticism through the work of Osvaldo Ayola and several other scholars in the process. My focus for this was really getting to the point that I was trying to sort of make us recognize that we as scholars need to be able to respect creative worlds of comics because we ought to already know better. These are worlds of creators, artists, whole different kinds of varieties who are often taken for granted. And we as academics are often taken for granted. So hopefully we can find that compassion and sympathy and recognize we have some alliances to build. All right, and then I'm gonna just do a quick run through of some of the images and key points for my presentation, which I kind of built off that blog post and ran through some guidance for this process. I also talked about how much I hate photos of myself, which I do. But if I'm going to be reflexive, I got to be reflexive. So the kind of first point I wanted to really emphasize with this presentation was considering your position, recognizing who you are and how you fit into a set of systems of power as a scholar and otherwise. Who are we? What is our position? Where are we coming from? And how does that shape our understanding of comics or understanding of aesthetics? I teach comics artists, and in critiques, we're constantly asking, okay, but what do you mean by it's good or not? What do you mean this is bad? You have to explain those terms. And yet I think so often scholars take for granted why we choose the works we choose to focus on, what stuff we celebrate versus what stuff we don't, but also who gets to tell the stories and histories behind comics. So I included some discussion of my own experiences in presenting on comics, and I also emphasized this kind of problem with international comic studies, where there's often this kind of holding up of national boundaries as if they really solidified what comics was in each context. So for instance, looking at comics creators in and of India who have moved beyond those kinds of boundaries. So Amrita Patel is a really well-known graphic novelist and artist who now works out of France. Aditya Bidikar, as well as Ranvi and Anand Arke, are folks who are coming out of Indian comics as an industry and really establishing themselves in the United States and in other comics industries, because these industries don't really hold to those national boundaries, but also thinking about how we tell the stories behind these works. So looking at some graphic novelists in India today, like Sanath Banerjee, who's done work in other countries and lives in Germany now, as well as Vishwajyoti Ghosh, who, you know, his work is and isn't graphic novels. It does and doesn't do the things that scholars tend to argue it does do. But also pointing out some of my own kinds of surprises in doing research on comics in India, such as hearing a usage of the term mini comics to describe something very different in the work of Amitabh Kumar, author of Raj Comics for the Hard-Headed. And again, thinking about those international creators who are working beyond those national boundaries, like Jasjot Singh Hans, Devaki Nyogi, and furthermore, contemporary Indian creators who are forming collectives to question what comics is, even in India itself, like Comic Sense, founded by Arijit Sen, Ani Sengupta, and Francesca Cotta. And these are just kind of examples from their social media, as well as a story illustrated by the artist. I think this is the work of Rai, kind of showing that there's so much more possible within comics in India than a lot of scholarship would probably recognize. The second point being, we need to question our orientation, drawing on the work of Sarah Ahmed, as well as my own experiences as a creator who's heard other creators bitch about scholars. Kind of recognizing what is our approach to comics, what are our assumptions, again, what are our aesthetics, who gets to be celebrated and who doesn't. Here I use a pretty detailed case study of Priya Shakti, a relatively popular globally comic, supposedly of India, but made more so in an Indian American context and illustrated by a white American illustrator within the comics industry. And instead shifting focus through the scholarship specifically of Rukmini Pandey and Samira Nadkarni, who point instead to other works from India doing the work that this work is often acclaimed for, doing feminist interventions in the comics medium, educating people about the experiences of creators, such as Drawing the Line, Indian Women Fight Back, and the Gacy Zine issue 4, and The Elephant in the Room, Women Draw Their World from the Spring Collective, allied with Priya Kuryan, a really prominent illustrator in India. And pointing to the fact that these are continuing interventions. Gacy Zine is putting out multiple issues. There's been a lot of really solid scholarship coming out in the last few years about zine culture in India and how it's expanding a lot of who gets access to these media, but scholarship hasn't necessarily caught up on all fields. The other main thing here is ask and listen before taking action. We have to be vulnerable and reflect on our own experiences as scholars. So again, asking us to think about who are we? How are we coming into these communities? How do we think about ourselves? As a folklorist for my work, communities guide scholarship, not the other way around. And so I looked at a little bit of my own experience in doing field work, as well as thinking about methods based on folklorists like Deborah Kodish, who works with the Philadelphia Folklore Project, and Osvaldo Ayala's work on thinking about how do we hold ourselves accountable, potentially through reflexivity and autoethnography, allowing ourselves to be disoriented through the process of seeing scholars like Osvaldo Ayala with me as a creator and scholar and us alongside creators as part of a larger community of comics. And so my kind of concluding point here is all of those tips, but also just get uncomfortable. We really do need to deconstruct the assumptions we make as scholars along the way of doing our work. And I point to a couple of recommendations of some specific stuff to check out in that ending section. But I just want to end here by saying, why don't we prove that we're worthy of creators' time rather than asking the opposite question? We should be asking how to flourish ourselves.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. Now up is Jonathan Flowers.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jonathan Flowers from Worcester State University, and my talk, what comic studies can learn from Mononoke Aware, emerged in part as a response to some of the things that Jeremy is pointing out, but also in response to my perception of a lack of application of non-Western aesthetic principles to the study of comic art. So in my blog post, I give a brief overview of Mononoke Aware and then apply it broadly to a couple of examples in comic art. This kind of application is expanded in the recorded presentation on the ICAF site. So what I'm gonna do right now is give a kind of brief overview of some of the upshots or some of the more metaphysical claims that come out of my work. All right. So the first thing that, at least in thinking about Mononoke Aware as a framework to think through comics and comic art, is we need to go all the way back to the ground of how we engage with works of art. So for Motoori Norinaga, the Japanese philologist and aesthetician who develops Mononoke Aware, the purpose of Mononoke Aware and the purpose of literature broadly, literature in specific and art broadly, is to cultivate our kokoro such that we can understand the felt sense of an experience when we engage with it through art or other materials, such that we can recognize that same felt experience in our broader lives. Now, kokoro in Japanese refers to the heart-mind, a combined sensing and feeling affective organ which orients us in the world. To be clear, kokoro is what enables us to be touched and in touch with objects in the world, such that we know what they are and how to respond appropriately to them. And insofar as kokoro is this kind of feeling, sensing organ, it's not simply limited to humans. Objects, animals, words all possess kokoro. And this is fundamental to Norinaga's understanding of how literature connects the kokoro of individuals across time and social distance. Specifically for Norinaga, the organization of works of art enable the apperception of what he calls aware, which is the felt sense of a situation. In the slide here, Norinaga describes aware as being used to designate a situation where we say ahare, and ahare for Norinaga is an onomatopoeia for kind of sighing wistfully or sighing at the sense of something. And so for Norinaga, our sense of aware, or how we are moved through the interaction of our kokoro with the world to say sigh at the sense of something, results in our perception of aware. So we can be moved by the sight of things, moved by the sound of things, moved by the thought of things, and so on and so forth. But for Norinaga, the very capacity for us to be moved through the contact of our kokoro with the kokoro of something else is what grounds literature's power and broadly comic art's power to cultivate the kokoro. That is, because words, objects, art possess kokoro itself, the ways in which, say, words are organized to make present in aware or make present the kokoro of a given experience allows a reader to connect with the kokoro of that experience across space, and time through the media of literature. And understanding this, as I argue in the blog post and the extended presentation, allows us to reframe what it is that comic art does. Again, for Norinaga, the purpose of literature isn't to expound on moral themes and it isn't to demonstrate technical skill, but to represent the aware or the kokoro of a given event as it was experienced, such that we can come to recognize that aware broadly in the world. And insofar as comics as a multimodal medium relies on both text and images, in my argument, comics possesses the capacity to cultivate or make present in aware in a much more thorough way than other kinds of media. That is because a comic can present the aware of an image, that is the attitude of a given individual, as well as the aware that emerges from the organization of words on a page. A piece of comic art can move a person's kokoro in such a way as to have a deeper experience than either images or text alone. So in the extended talk, one of the examples I use of, say, aware as cultivated through or as made present through comic art is a panel from Rurouni Kenshin and a panel from The Flash. Now, I've selected both of these panels because the intention was to make present the inhuman speed of the characters depicted. So in the panel with The Flash, speed, or the aware of speed, is made present through, say, blurring the Flash and duplicating his image across the surroundings. In the panel from Kenshin, Kenshin's speed is indicated by Kenshin's stillness, while the angles of his cuts are demonstrated across the panel. That is, to cultivate an aware of inhuman speed in the Flash, we need to duplicate the Flash's image in different locations. He's moving so fast as if to appear in multiple areas. For Kenshin, he moves, or for Kenshin, the cultivation of aware happens not because Kenshin is in multiple places at once, but because his sword is in multiple places at once, and the effects of which are seen in the panel below it. Also, we should take note of the ways that the panels are organized in sequence. This panel is from the Japanese version of the Kenshin manga, so you would not read it in the same order as the American version, which results in a different way of representing the aware of speed. So while this demonstration has been a little bit brief, one of the things that I'm trying to do in both the blog post and the extended presentation is present the value of thinking about comics through non-Western modes of aesthetic appreciation. And while I've chosen to use Norinaga's Mono no Aware specifically for Norinaga's grounding in literature and his brief comments on art, a similar thing can be done through Ziami's Kaden show with regards to making present the kokoro effect, which draws a reader into the literature, or through Confucian aesthetics, which argue for the organization of literature such that we learn to extend benevolence through a society as the works circulate. So one of the things that I'm trying to do with this presentation is make clear the value of considering comic art through non-Western or predominantly non-Western aesthetic theories, and how this can broaden the ways in which we think about how comics do what they do. And as I say on the slide here, specifically with regards to Mono no Aware, if the role of Mono no Aware in art is to enable the cultivation of kokoro sensitive to the aware of a variety of experiences, then for Norinaga, the concern of what comics do within comic studies should be how they articulate and relate experience through the medium. That is, how do they make present the aware, the felt experience of what is being depicted on the page to a reader. And that is my brief 5-minute version of my longer talk. So
Great, thanks, Jonathan. And up next is Kenneth.
Great, thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to be on this panel. So I'm going to be giving a condensed version of my presentation here. All right, critical bibliographic and artist book approaches to understanding comics materiality. So we're going to start off with the definition of artist books for the sake of this presentation. So artist books take irrevocable advantage of the formal and material qualities and perceptions of the book to create art symbiotic with and experimenting with book formats. Both artist books and comics, I argue, are invested in using such self-conscious bookishness and perceptions of conventions to generate new meaning and experience. To quote book artist Amaranth Borsuk, both traditions consciously engage with how forms affect meaning and how audiences come to make meaning through engagement with reading conventions. Artist books emphasize, denaturalize, and deliberately synthesize contents, format, and form, just like effective comics do. Freed from the demands of transparent delivery of textual information, artist books are more open to creating inventive aesthetic, sensory, narrative material, and directly reactionary experiences for readers. Many contemporary art comics function similarly, and I argue that this dynamic makes comics and artist books ideal forms for bibliographic study and for pointing us toward a future of the print book. So this presentation and the larger one is largely structured around taking a look at different scholars of artist books and applying and considering their ideas in a comics context. So critical bibliographer Bonnie Mack provides us with the term pagina. While akin to a page, a pagina need not be a full physical page, but rather any space dictated by visual or material arrangements. The pagina and physical page both influence meaning by the distinctive embodiment of the ideas they transmit. Comics panels, rows, and other segments can be seen as paginas, which compose the larger pagina of the page. Here's an example. A comics panel serves both as a pagina of its own and as a mark that forms part of a focused and sometimes singular drawn sign, which is a focus of another larger pagina, the page. Comics artists can play with this junction and tension between the space of the full page and the space of the pagina panel to trouble the distinction between moments and modes of reading, both distorting and relying upon the pagina format. Those comics which make readers grapple with the space of reading in this way are akin to artist books and how they challenge readers to generate unique approaches to form and content. Regarding the page, Joanna Drucker declares that in every book, a decision has to be made about how to either emphasize, ignore, or overcome the fact that the openings are discrete units, separate space, each from the next, and yet part of a continuous whole. In comics, it is not that discrete page units have to be emphasized, ignored, or overcome, but rather integrated precisely into the reading experience on the panel level, as this chapter from Watchmen is well known for. When a reader opens a comic, they see not only one page, but the full spread. Thus, pages must be carefully distributed, as a transition from one page to another will always be a transition between pagina panels. Drucker further notes that Roland Barthes described how language can either anchor meaning in an image or help serve a relay function to put an image into relation with other elements. Without language to serve these delimiting functions, Barthes emphasizes the image floats, a site for many possible interpretations. Comics, and especially wordless ones, engage in a unique dynamic in which images almost always act instead of or alongside of Barthes' language to delimit the interpretations of juxtaposed images. However, there is always some room for floating or interpretive ambiguity. Here's an example from Lai Westbin's Hacks. Indeed, the stylistic decisions made with distinctly rendered images means that readers do not always interpret stylistic decisions as much as they may feel them. Comics artists engage consciously in this resistance to interpretation in comics form through means like abstraction and non sequitur, generating ergodic and meta experiences for readers. It is akin to one of Ulises Carrion's claims. In a book of the new art, words don't transmit any intention. They're used to form a text, which is an element of a book, and it is this book as a totality that transmits the author's intention. If one were to posit the new art of comic books, one would state that new art comics are those which are consciously unified into the totality of the book. a classic example from Chris Ware. In this sense, it is also true for comics readers that to read a comic successfully and richly, one must apprehend the book as a structure, identifying its elements and understanding their function, as Carrion states in regards to artist books. It is merely that often comics readers are not wholly aware they are doing so subsumed is comics reading in the cultural subconscious. Comics in the avant-garde and alternative traditions often disrupt the subconsciousness by manipulating conventions of the codexed comic. These comics both foreground prior conventions and communicate imaginative phenomena in Richard Kostelanetz' sense via new ways of reading comics. Not only do they often violate narrative or expository conventions, but sometimes they're not expressly narrative or expository at all, foregrounding the sensory pleasure of the viewing experience. Often, such comics, like Drucker's artist books, show a margin, gutter, frame, or page to be both the thing that it is and also shows an awareness of the features that form the identity of that element, as Drucker states of artist books. Their rupture from convention and investment in style both provides an aesthetic experience of sensation, and once that experience has been processed, an exploration of what comics conventions can be and do. So I just ran quickly through a few examples of how comics strongly align with artist books and how they can be productively read through theoretical frameworks in that field. I believe that looking at comics that pointedly engage with these material and artist book dynamics will often mean drawing scholarly attention to less appreciated, less seen avant-garde work. And in addition, asserting that comics can function similarly to artist books, with all of artist books' self-conscious, inextricable material attention to print, shows the vitality and value of the print book format today. And yeah, that is my condensed presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kenneth. And finally, Clairevo, you're up.
Hey, let's see if I can make this work. Does that work? I hope that everyone is seeing my slides and not my notes. Thanks, Andy. Hi, I'm Claireosinervo. I'm postdoc at the University of Calgary, but I'm speaking to you today from the unceded Indigenous territory of Teotihuac or Montreal, where the Kenyan, Kahaka, or Mohawk people have acted as custodians of the land for generations. If you want to do more to move in solidarity with First Nations peoples acting collectively and independently where I live, I ask that you consider searching for Resilience Montreal and then subsequently consider volunteering your time or donating resources. That's Resilience Montreal. I also want to thank Biz and Co for their tireless work, Andy for moderating, and my co-panelists for bringing such fantastic work. I'm really honored and happy to be on this panel. A theory panel is often just another name for a bits and bobs panel, so frequently the presentations don't end up connecting to each other. But as I reviewed everyone else's videos yesterday, I got really excited for the affinities and overlaps and cross-pollinations between the research that we're doing. For my part, maybe I'll assume that you've already seen the video and instead kind of explain where the presentation came from and see if I can cram in some new spins on it. And at the same time, I'll ask you to consider this image that I have up and think about what is different about the valences and tonality of these two pages. So I think I started like knowingly caring about color in comics around the time that I wrote my master's thesis, which was really more about materiality for text, almost like new textual criticism, book futurism rather than book history. But the project was functionally an exercise in looking at one comic that had been reprinted over and over in different formats and adapted to other media, and then looking closely at what I could read and interpret from the differences in those versions. Much like the kind of methodology that Kenneth so elegantly describes in his video. But I was thinking about it in terms of differential media, differentiality. And amidst thinking about paper stock and binding and mobility and smell, I also needed to pay a lot of attention to color. So The project was also, that project a million years ago was also about distributed authorship and a kind of like a whinging, a complaint on my part about how literary criticism had failed to adapt a Foucauldian model of the author function, and close to 50, after like 50 years, now over 50 years of its existence, we're still using the romantic notion of the author. And I kind of failed in that regard when it came to looking at coloring as a type of authorship. Instead, I was viewing colorists as designers, as laborers or set dressers, or whatever poor metaphor for close to below the line labor you want to make, but not quite below the line. But I realized I had another chance when I started teaching comics a few years later. And that's really where this presentation started to take shape as a seminar. It seemed ludicrous to me that I could teach an entire 13-week course on comics, most of which were in color, and only glancingly mention it here or there, rather than really stretching out and dedicating full classes to it. So I did decide to stretch out and take that space and step far outside of my own comfort zone. Now, I was teaching in an English department, and 2 of my 3 degrees come from English departments. Usually, syllabi ask students to obtain specific editions of texts so that everyone's on the same page, literally. And instead of doing that, I encouraged my students to source whatever text they wanted, however they wanted. And this allowed me to do almost the same thing with them that I tried to do in my video, except as a discussion instead. And so that went over well enough that, and I started seeing students account for color in their analyses beautifully enough that I thought it would be useful to infuse it with some theory and bring it to a more academic crowd. And I've kind of been trying to take it on tour for a few years and get feedback, ideas for proper fine arts theory to bring into it. You'll notice it's mostly comms theory at this point. Some color theory, some decoded and negotiated versions of text. And I'm also trying to find space to give it attention eventually, give it the attention that it needs to seek publication for it somewhere. I really want to see this vein get tapped, you know. I'd love a comic studies world where it's routine for scholars to position themselves in their work, as Jeremy suggests, as well as the positionality of the text that they're working with. Because publishers think color is the most mutable part of a text. I think that's about all I have in terms of just prepared material. But forget about that. Let's quite happily get to the exciting discussion part.
Great, thanks, Clairevo. And everybody can, I think, unmute or start your video up again so that we can do the discussion. And so please, everybody at home listening, please, and watching, please feel free to start putting questions into the Q&A box. But one of the things I wanted to start, I mean, several of you, or you all did a good job of pointing out that there are these great connections between all your papers, and I agree that is a really fascinating thing about how this panel is put together. And one of the things I was wondering, and the structure of this panel kind of works towards this, is to maybe start with Jeremy, but see, like, are there ways that you notice that the other 3 papers are modeling the kind of questioning of positionality and so on that your paper discusses? And then if others want to chime in about how they saw their work kind of reflected in what Jeremy was asking for.
I thought, I mean, going through the papers as presentations first, I think I was most struck by Clairevo's really centering colorists is a huge step, especially within the comics industry, because colorists are often still dropped from covers in terms of getting credit. And they're a central part of the comic book industry, especially in mainstream comics, but they're so often kind of left off. So I thought that was really lovely. I also appreciated Jonathan's centering of a non-Western aesthetic approach. I think there's maybe the issue of the artist book. I think this isn't really Kenneth's issue. This is more the artist book as an object within the comics industry right now is very contested, especially because most comics creators see the artist book as appropriating zine culture. and whereas zine culture is oriented around community, and it's about sharing and low costs and not charging a lot of money, not spending a lot of money, artist books are not. They're very much about high investment, high costs, high quality. And so I think, you know, it's tricky because it just happened recently that there was a Twitter discourse about this, which probably y'all aren't aware of, but I teach undergrads who are obsessed with comics communities online. And so they were very much talking this week about, can you believe the artist book people? And so we got into it in class, talking about how zines are very much an important part of any kind of overlap between artist books and comics. But I do think that a lot of scholarship about artist books takes for granted that artist books exist without that overlap. They do exist with that overlap, and that does need to be part of that scholarship more. I don't think Kenneth was really dealing with that, so I hope you don't feel like I'm like critiquing your paper. It's more that that was something I thought of in going through your work, which I thought was really thorough, but didn't necessarily touch on that.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with your points. And one thing that I'm wrangling with in larger work, including my dissertation, is I forget, I think it's Drucker has a quote along the lines of, the comic is the democratic promise of the artist book made real. And that is, you know, hypothetically, with their genesis, artist books were meant to be multiples that were not expensive, that were accessible to people, and yet were rigorously invested in exploring the medium and presenting art to publics and stuff like that. And zine culture and comic culture as well, to me, is really carrying forward what artist books should have been doing, right? You know, attending conventions. Like I'm based both in Boston and San Francisco. So the Boston Art Book Fair, the San Francisco Art Book Fair, you're struck by the vast number of zine and comics creators there who are selling work at reasonable prices, if not sometimes for free. And then the 3 or 4 artist book sellers that have, you know, a book made of inflatables that is $800. And that dynamic of, okay, these comics are presenting the formal and format promise of what artist books can be without the, I mean, kind of, I don't want to say awful, but there's something that is distasteful about the way that a reproduced form like artist books can be so exclusionary in both its pretentiousness and its that's definitely something I have considered and I'm continuing to consider.
Does anybody else want to take up the question about how they see their work today fitting into the kind of questioning of positionality and so on that Jeremy brought up?
So I kind of want to branch off from that, right? So Jeremy's work asks us to recognize our own positionality when encountering comics, particularly comics comics that don't emerge from a Western milieu. And this is a point that I largely agree with, specifically as given my background in East Asian philosophy, most of the comics that I like to look at are manga. And so when thinking about the kind of work that I'm doing, trying to bring in non-Western aesthetic concepts as ways to, say, engage with comic work, I think of this as kind of a broader extension of what Jeremy's doing, radically decentering our theoretical assumptions about how to engage with comics as a work, as a medium, and what the comic does. And I think in my broader talk, I start by reframing the introduction of MacLeod's understanding comics through Norinaga, such that it's not such that the work that a comic does as juxtaposed images in sequence is to articulate an aware. And to understand how comics do that, you need to radically rethink what art does in a broader cultural sense. And so I see some of the stuff that I'm trying to do as perhaps the logical extension of what Jeremy is up to, in asking us to recognize not only our positionality of our positionality as scholars, but asking us to recognize the positionality of the scholarly approaches we take with regards to comics. And so, I mean, at least in my view, to take up the more extreme variation on what Jeremy is saying, there is no reason why the scholarship on comics and comic art should proceed primarily from a Western understanding of what art and what comics do, right? There's no reason why we cannot engage with comics through other traditions, but in keeping with what Jeremy says, we need to recognize our own positionality as we do so, right? So it's not simply we can go grab aesthetic traditions from the world over and start applying them. We need to have a kind of thorough understanding of the cultural, philosophical, metaphysical underpinnings that allow these aesthetic traditions to do what they're doing.
Maybe I'll branch off of that, because just as Jonathan felt that his work was sort of branching off of Jeremy's, I sort of watched Jonathan's video and felt like what I was trying to talk about was branching off of what he was doing in terms of thinking about the other kinds of modes through which you get interpretive practices and the types of things that you pay attention to. And when I start trying to talk about color in comics, I end up talking so much about like mood, aura, tone, embodiment, emotion, and when I'm like reading about like Aware, I'm like, oh, it's about like trying to exude a certain sense of something. And I don't know, I don't want to be like bastardizing it, right? Because it was, I feel like you were very, very clear that Aware is about like the sense of what the thing is, and this is sort of like trying to create different senses through color. And as to your original question, Andy, about like positionality, one of the reasons that I have been sort of keep taking this around to talk to other people rather than just like publishing something on it is because of my own positionality as not a fine arts person, not a person who knows a lot about like I don't want to like just drop in and go like, this is how we put color in comics, without having like done the serious background reading into art history and the materiality of visual arts. So it's sort of, that's why it ends up coming from such like a comms perspective employed in such an English lit context, because I'm still trying to work out the positionality of it and how to account for those other aspects.
Great, thanks everybody. So I just want to mention that because there's such rich potential here for this conversation, and we're getting a lot of questions in, and we have 4 panelists rather than 3 like we normally do. We're going to go an extra 15 minutes tonight, if everybody's okay with that. If you have any pressing engagements, feel free to kick off if you have to. And one thing before we get to the questions, I really like some of the things that this virtual conference is able to accomplish, but one of the things I really regret is that I cannot like pin each of you down in some kind of awkward hotel lobby conversation, something to kind of drill into what you're talking about, because every one of these papers is just like really ringing up some new ideas and questions for me. But I'm going to go switch to the questions from the audience. And so the first question we got in is for Jeremy, and it's from Martha Coleman. She writes, I'm interested in how you cited Sarah Ahmed. I haven't heard her work used in reference to comic studies, and I wondered if you could mention which book, is anyone else writing about positionality, because I agree that this is crucial. And she also adds, as a comic scholar, I'm acutely aware of trying not to exploit comics artists.
So there's quite a bit in there. I specifically was using Ahmed's work on orientation, which I'm forgetting the book it was specifically in, because the original version of it I encountered was a chapter in an edited volume. And I ended up kind of going between the two because she was making different points in each piece, but with this like similar sections. But yeah, I think that the book was Queer Phenomenology. Oh, and Jonathan already had it. But yeah, I mean, I haven't seen it necessarily used in reference to comics in published works. I think I've probably heard it at some presentations, but I don't remember specifically. That was something that came out of conversations, honestly, at the Comic Studies Society in, oh my God, 2019. And in terms of thinking about positionality in comics, unfortunately, I haven't seen that much on it. And when I try to assign work on this topic for my students who are comics creators themselves, um, it's tough to find material that's easily available. I think there are some pieces out there, but they're often behind paywalls. My school doesn't necessarily have the best access to research. Um, I will say, I think that it's really important to think about that in the context of international comics. And gosh, I forget, what was there, is there something I have missed in the question? Because I'm a little scatterbrained right now.
No, I think you actually answered it.
One thing I would add is just something that I'm often frustrated by is the fact that, whenever I do a presentation on comics in India, no one ever asks me, who am I to be doing this? And I'm always ready to answer that question, but nobody ever asks, I'm a white, queer, doodly person in the United States. What am I doing this work? I have a lot of thoughts on that, but it fundamentally comes down to, I got into this from an anthropological perspective. It was seen as you need to go somewhere else to do field work that is not the US. My original intention was to study zine culture in the Great Lakes region. And then once I got into this, I met people who were opening their homes to me and showing me their work and including me in events. It was a wonderful community, and I can't see myself not supporting these artists and trying to get their work out there and trying to organize stuff to really highlight how they are moving across international barriers in so many ways and aren't necessarily as visible as they should be. All right, I'll stop there.
Jeremy, you actually answered the next question. So, which is from your self-reflexivity exercise and your research, what limitations did you realize exist as a white person understanding the interpretation of Indian comics?
And I will say, I'm just touching the surface of it. There's a lot more beyond that. Like a lot more beyond that. A lot of assumptions I had coming into that culture, you know, everyone was so kind about it, but that also feeds into the kinds of cross-cultural dynamics and the legacy of colonialism. My whiteness gets in the way a lot, but it also, you know, I think more than anything, it is the work of these creators who are helping ground me in these histories that I am often not aware of, or the dynamics I'm not aware of, walking me through things like Dali ethnic minority group members who are trying to make comics, and people don't necessarily say, oh, but they're a member of that group, or talking to comics creators whose lives are being threatened for the work that they're doing, like Orjit Sen, someone I've been speaking with for a decade now, who has been threatened because of the political work he creates, and him, you know, walking me through why this is happening and helping me understand how he continues to make work. I mean, it's these creators who are really brilliant and drive my work.
Thanks. So the next question is for Kenneth and Clairvo. The writer Morgan Pedraza writes, I'm interested in the way that the term materiality is being used in both of your presentations. Materiality includes both the content and physical properties of an object, in this case comics. Your presentation's largely focused on the content side, color, text, image, and I'm wondering how you are thinking about the physical properties of the comics, theories, and processes that you're thinking about.
So this is something that I'm thinking about a lot, and in part this presentation was inspired by Aaron Cashin's Between Pen and Pixel, which is a book that details materiality from a very post-digital perspective. And one of the issues I found myself running into in that book is I found that his analysis, while excellent in many cases, is largely focused on the content materiality rather than the materiality of the book as a physical object. One part of my research that I'm conducting is I'm looking into risograph comics, their physical specificities, and someone who is involved in book history and critical bibliography. I'm going to be visiting risograph studios and detailing production processes and print specification and modes of creation that they're doing in the hopes of getting to that physical element of the book more strongly. I'm also, very much in the lineage of the sort of D.F. Mackenzie take, which is like a sociology of text, should also account for the ways that people are interacting with physical book objects in a sort of literary sense of understanding them. And I think there are a lot of comics out there that work well in that capacity. Art Spiegelman's In the Shadow of No Towers, a giant board book of a text that deals with the literally monumental event of 9/11 is sort of enacting its themes through its physical materiality. Building Stories is another quintessential example of a book where you are literally building the story through the material action of distributing all of the codices and zines that compose that book around you. So yeah, I mean, materiality is great. And this sort of it's mostly on topic, but I was really struck by Jeremy's question of why don't we prove that we're worthy of creators' time rather than vice versa? And one thing I'm trying to do through going to the studios is to, deal with that question, juggle that question. I've also written for Bubbles fanzine, which is a fanzine popular in certain communities, and I'm in touch with Brian, who's a creator, and I'm hoping to be publishing material from my dissertation concurrently in the fanzine so that people from those communities, such as those risograph presses, have access to it as well. So yeah.
I feel like Kenneth touched on some of the same kind of themes. I do think that I addressed materiality in the video. I didn't talk about it that much here today. Especially, we always talk about the digital as like immaterial, and I was very much trying to make the point that it's not. Right now, I'm pressing the button to change the brightness on my screen so that you all come into sharper definition. I can change the contrast. I can turn off this light, and that's going. These are all material differences. And these are all involved like digital materiality, and they'll all be mediated again on your side of the screen. This is sort of like, there's not that much work being done in digital comics and that. So that's sort of like, I was always trained by my mentors to like find where there's a hole in scholarship and then go like start throwing stones into it and see how deep the well goes. And so that's sort of the direction I've headed in. But as far as thinking about like print objects, I think I also in the talk a bit about like chemical processes, fading pages, coffee stains, the wrinkling of pages. All of these things also warp, affect, transform color, and then you can come back to it years and years later, and your memory fades the same way a photograph does, and your nostalgia fades the same way a photograph does. It is a very weird experience to go and pick up some of the few floppies that I've kept from the early 90s, which all had foil wraparound covers, because that's what was hot in like 1994. But also, I mean, I could go on about this for a long time, but I want to leave space for other things. I love thinking about dimensionality and the size, especially when it comes to like absolute editions, like taking something that used to be this big and making it this big, and like, what is that even for? It is obviously a status object of some kind. How are you going to read that on the bus? In what context do you read it? Only by a fire, maybe in a mahogany chair. But those are some of the like launching off points for the way that I think about other aspects of materiality and how color works into them.
Thanks. It is an accident, it's totally coincidence that my copy of Building Stories is right over the top of my head, but there's another problem with materiality. Where do you put it? It's where I would put a board game, basically. So I actually had a question for Clairevo, because one of the things you mentioned in your talk here was about how when you teach a book, you let students kind of pick the edition that they're most comfortable with, that they want to use. I do that too, and one of the things I'm often shocked by is seeing differences that I never realized were, like, existed between editions. So I'm wondering, like, how do you deal with those things when, like, if you're showing an example in class and a student says, my book doesn't have that, or my book doesn't look like that? How do you kind of play off of that?
We talk about how it changed the book for them usually. I think I was on my like third time teaching Fun Home before I realized that the print edition is like very gray in its like, we think of that book as black and white, but it's not black and white. I think it's like slightly blue. But if you look at the digital edition, it is bright blue. It's totally different like darkening and shading than it was. And I was like on my third time teaching that book before a student pointed it out to me and said, hey, we're supposed to talk about color. Why is the one on your slide different from the one in my hand? But I love it when they say, I don't have this thing, or I do have this thing. It's the whole point of it for me. One of the books I teach is Meanwhile. I don't know if y'all have read Meanwhile by Jason Shiga. But there's like an app version of that comic, and it's like the first book I have them read for the course, because I just don't want them. It's an English course, and I want to just like disabuse them of the idea that we're just going to be like falling in love with words in this book, in this class. And try as I might, there are panels in Meanwhile that I cannot get to, and when you zoom out on the app version of it, you can see every single panel in the entire text. There's like, I don't want to go on and on with it, but the short answer to the question is we make it the focus of what we talk about, and I tell them to write their term paper about that difference because I think it's really important. I think that we pick up like a Charles Dickens book today and we say like a great work of literature in these 300 pages, not acknowledging for one single second that it was published periodically. We got paid by the word, and that's why he spends 10 pages describing a room. And I think that like this materiality to me is about context, and differential media perspectives about context too.
Just to kind of build on one example that I'm kind of confused by and challenged by is how different I teach. My favorite thing is monsters every semester, and I'm amazed. The differences are not just in color, though there are significant color differences throughout, but there's things taken out that in the later version that's not in the first edition that I have, and yet there's kind of, unlike they say the absolute edition or the the different versions of Batman Year One you can get, there's no easy way to distinguish the different versions of My Favorite Thing is Monsters that have all these differences. I want to also give the panel time, if you have questions for each other that you want to shoot around too, please feel free.
I don't actually have a question, but I wanted to answer the question directed to Jeremy, specifically with reference to Sarah Med. Nick Miller uses a lot of Sarah Med's work in talking about the queer possibilities of comics. His piece in the Oxford Handbook of Comic Studies draws heavily on Ahmed's work to talk about the queer positionality of Dazzler, and some of his other work does too. but yeah, Ahmed's been taken up by a couple of folks within comic studies, myself included, to talk through the positionality both of readers and comic scholars. I think, Jeremy, though, I think your talk is the first time that I've seen it taken up and deployed with regards to comic scholarship.
Cool. Thank you for those references. I knew that there were folks talking at it about this at CSS. I couldn't remember the specifics, but of course it was Nick. I watched his paper. I just have a terrible memory.
Clairvo, you have your hand up, right?
Yeah, I had a question for Jonathan, actually. I watched the video twice and I read the blog post and then I listened to you talk, and there are aspects of this that I'm like still trying to wrap my head around. And I'm wondering how do we go about deploying these readings of it, and what when we radically recenter the like what our like point is of like engaging with these texts, with comics in the first place, comics for examples, the examples we're all using. How are we then going to like upend and actualize those readings and interpretations? Am I even still like appropriately using these same terms, right? Like is it still, when I think about it in terms of like generating a ware and bringing out kokoro, I feel like when I'm then like, so what does that scholarship look like? I'm like, am I still just westernizing it and not decentering it enough and going to that like Eastern philosophical place?
So with regards to, say, Momo no Aware and Kokoro and so on and so forth, no. So the problem with what you would run into is if you, and this is a problem that comes up in comparative and cross-cultural philosophy, if you use the, say, non-Western work as a jumping off point to talk about what you really want to talk about, which is the Western framework. That is to say, here's this non-Western framework and it functions like this Western framework. So I'm going to use the trappings of the non-Western framework to really talk about a work through a mode of Western scholarship, right? And so that is one of the ways one could do that, right? And that I think is particularly problematic as it gets into a lot of the problems that Jeremy points out in his talk.
Yeah, that's like the part where it's like I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. It seems like it's beside the point to try to appropriate it in that way.
Well, so yes, because the thing that I'm pointing to is not so much, or is not so much the use of the conceptual language. It's more the presentation of the conceptual language and then saying it functions identically to this Western concept and then treating it as if it functions identical to this Western concept, right? So this, basically, you're not taking the conceptual or the concept on its own cultural and social ground, which is one of those interesting points. It is not the case that something like Aware functions in the same way as, I don't know, a Kantian sublime, right? Despite having similar affective valences. Norinaga might say the Kantian sublime is an Aware, but does not exhaust it, right? And so one of the, if I'm going to take up Jeremy's recommendation to talk about positionality and how we do it, the best advice I would give there is know what you're talking about, right? It's not simply I read a couple of papers on this and now I can apply it, and more I've read the corpus and the extended or the works that surround it, the cultural context that surround it. Because for example, in my talk, Norinaga, in the extended version, I do a lot to talk about the kokoro, right? Norinaga talks about the kokoro for like 5 seconds by appealing directly to Kino Surayuki and saying, this is the way that this works, right? without the understanding of, say, Heian era poetics, the ways that poetry emerges from the intersection of the kokoro of an individual with the kokoro of the natural world, which allows us to use metaphors that move us, because the metaphor carries the aware of the object you're referring to, right? That teasing out becomes more difficult, right? So to bring it all the way back and to bring in some of what Jeremy is saying, you have to recognize your own positionality as somebody who is new to this area, new to these ways of interpreting familiar works, and be comfortable with being unfamiliar with the work and not try to, or the conceptual elements, and not try to drag them out of their context. Go find the context and understand how what you're bringing to it can function within that overall theoretical or otherwise context. And I think if I'm going to extend this a little bit further, I think this is kind of why the predominance of say, comic scholarship, the theoretical approaches we take are typically grounded in a Western milieu, right? Because understanding the role of literature in Confucian aesthetics, right? To help organize and maintain social harmony through properly cultivating and directing the shin, right, towards the extension of benevolence, requires understanding, ritual propriety, benevolence, the heart, mind, self-cultivation within these new milieus. And that's a lot of work to ask of scholars. It's much easier to say, well, this functions like, habits and so on and so forth, right? So to answer your question, to avoid the appropriation, don't simply borrow the conceptual terms and then say, this functions parallel to this Western concept, right? Take up the conceptual terms within their own context. And then if you need to bring in some say, Western terms, and here I'm using Western as an incredibly broad blanket, we could say similar things about other marginalized traditions of aesthetic appreciation, right? Understand the cultural, social, intellectual context of the work. And then if you need to use some Western terms to, make it familiar to your audience, express what you're doing, right? And don't simply articulate a sameness, because there isn't, right?
I'll just throw in a hell yeah. And also kind of note that the discomfort you feel in those moments is the point. You should be upending that comfort. And I think that recognizing that discomfort, pursuing that discomfort, can also help us recognize that a lot of times these artists, these creators, they're living in very vulnerable economic situations because of post-colonial or post-neoliberal capitalism, this kind of post-capitalist moment we're living in. And really, we should be looking at their conditions of labor and recognizing a lot of the same problems we're dealing with, and how we can potentially work alongside each other to maybe unionize, organize, resist in some fashion, or at the very least recognize that context is essential, and a lot of the work of oppression is decontextualizing and making those contexts seem irrelevant to the, like the genius of the scholar. The genius of the scholar is the community around them who's able to call them out and call them in.
I think, Jonathan, you put it really beautifully when you said, don't try to put it in your context, try to bring yourself to the context. And that's sort of an excellent starting point, and then acknowledge what you're doing on the way back out. Thank you.
Yeah, but the other thing I'd say about that is one of the things we might want to recognize is that theoretical concepts don't strictly live within their own cultural and contextual domain, right? So most of the work in comic studies, at least that I've reviewed, that does work with, say, with Japanese aesthetics is domain specific to manga, right? And there's no reason why that can't go elsewhere.
Great. I mean, that is I don't want to, I'm sorry to interrupt the conversation, but this is a kind of great place to end. Jeremy gave a big call to arms, I think, for where we should go forward with a lot of these ideas, and especially the ones that he brings up in his presentation. So thanks everybody for this great conversation that we've just had. I really wish we were heading to a hotel lobby bar or something like that where we could keep going with this, because that's what we would probably be doing at ICAF. But anyway, so I really appreciate everybody's participation. Thanks everybody at home who's been listening and providing questions for us. This is the last of the ICAF virtual conference events, but ICAF will be back in 2022. And so keep an eye out for more information on that.